Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into a pretty complex topic this time around, looking at the relationship between consumerism and freedom.
Oh, that is complex.
Yeah, it really is. And our guide for this deep dive is an article by Father Raymond J. D'Souza.
Okay.
And he kind of has this unique perspective.
Yeah.
Because he's both a Catholic priest, and an economist.
Huh. That's pretty unusual.
It's a really interesting combination, and it definitely informs his approach to this whole issue.
I can imagine. So where does he even begin with something like that?
Well, he starts with this question, this kind of central question. Can we actually enjoy all the good things, the benefits of a free market,
Right,
without falling into what he sees as this trap of consumerism?
it's a good question. And I think, honestly, it's a question that a lot of us are kind of wrestling with, especially nowadays, right? Like, we live in this society where it feels like everywhere you turn, there's another message telling you to buy something,
Oh, absolutely. Upgrade this, get the newest version of that. It's relentless. And that's kind of where D'Souza really gets things going, He doesn't see consumerism as this harmless thing.
Right.
Just a little indulgence. He sees it as something that actually threatens our freedom as human beings.
I mean, if you think about it, it does kind of make sense in a way. Like, if we're constantly defining ourselves by what we own, what we buy,
Yeah.
then are we really free?
That's exactly his point, that consumerism reduces us to objects. We become these kind of walking collections of what we own, instead of being subjects who can use those things, our possessions, for something greater, right? Like to actually serve other people, to live out a real purpose.
It's about aligning your actions with your values, with your higher calling, whatever that may be.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Oh.
D'Souza, he actually compares consumerism to communism.
Whoa, hold on. Communism, that's a pretty bold comparison, don't you think?
It is. But he sees this common thread, this tendency to kind of reduce the human person to an object in both ideologies.
Okay, I'm curious. How so?
Well, he even quotes Pope John Paul II from this encyclical, Centesimus Annus, which criticizes systems that basically treat people as mere means of production.
Oh, I see where he's going with this.
Right. Like whether it's the state controlling your work or advertising controlling your desires, it all kind of leads to the same place.
Loss of freedom.
Exactly. It's like a loss of individual freedom.
It is thought-provoking, that's for sure. But I guess just to clarify, D'Souza isn't saying that capitalism is inherently bad, right?
No, not at all. He's more focused on the temptations that come with a system that prioritizes economic freedom.
Yeah.
Like, how do we navigate that? How do we enjoy those freedoms without falling into those traps? And to understand his argument, I think it's helpful to have a little background on John Paul II's concept of Christian personalism. Have you ever heard of this?
I have, yeah.
Because D'Souza draws on this concept pretty heavily.
It's a rich concept, very nuanced. But essentially, it boils down to the idea that every single human being is created in the image of God.
Right.
And therefore has this inherent dignity, a purpose.
So how does that relate to consumerism?
Well, if you look at it from a Christian personalist perspective, true freedom is about aligning your life with your calling, right? With who you were created to be. It's not simply about being free to just chase whatever material desires come your way.
So it's less about freedom from something and more about freedom for something.
You got it. And that raises some interesting questions about our economic systems, right? Like, do they actually support us in living out our purpose? Or do they kind of hold us back?
Yeah, it's like if the system is constantly encouraging us to define ourselves by what we own, how can we possibly be free to live out a deeper calling?
And that kind of brings us to this really powerful line from Galatians. It says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand fast, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery."
Yeah, powerful stuff.
And I think, what D'Souza is suggesting here is that the consumerism, well, it can become a kind of yoke. It can be a form of bondage, really, that keeps us from experiencing true freedom.
Wow. It makes you think about John Paul II, who actually drew a parallel between consumerism and other kinds of slavery, like drug addiction, even pornography.
Oh, wow.
His point was that even good things,
Yeah.
they can become harmful when they take over our lives, when they distract us from what really matters. And it really makes you think about your own life, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does true freedom really mean to you?
I mean, that's a big question.
It is a big question. What are the things in your life that might be holding you back from really experiencing that freedom? It's deep stuff for sure, but I think that's why we do these deep dives, right? To push beyond the surface and grapple with these big questions about how we live, how we want to live. And where does capitalism fit into all of this? It feels like a huge part of the equation.
Well, John Paul II, he actually had a pretty nuanced view of capitalism. He saw it as the most effective system we have, really, for creating wealth, promoting innovation. But he was also super clear that it needed a really strong ethical framework.
Oh, interesting. Ethical and what was the other?
Cultural. Like there needs to be this strong ethical and cultural framework guiding it.
Yeah, sure.
Otherwise, economic freedom, it can easily become an end in itself, right? Yeah. And then you see all these problems like rampant consumerism. And that kind of leads to what he said about economic freedom being absolutized. Like, what do you think he meant by that?
Ooh, that's a good question. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. I think he's saying that, when we make economic freedom the ultimate goal, when we let everything else become secondary to the pursuit of profit, material wealth, then we've kind of lost sight of what really matters.
Yeah.
We've lost our priorities. It's about keeping things in their proper order, I think.
Okay, that makes sense.
And he used this phrase, juridical framework. Might sound a bit technical.
Yeah, a little bit.
But it's actually a really important idea.
So break that down for us. What does that mean?
Basically, he's saying that the laws, the policies we put in place, they can either encourage consumerism, or they can discourage it.
Oh, so they can actually shape our behavior.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Think about regulations on advertising, right? Tax policies that encourage people to save instead of spending all the time.
Right.
Even something as simple as, limiting store hours. It's about creating a system that kind of nudges people, to make more responsible choices rather than just constantly bombarding them with messages to buy more stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how those things can actually affect our desires, our internal desires.
It's almost like counterintuitive, isn't it?
It really is. So it's not just about our individual choices then. It's also about the systems we create, the messages they send.
Exactly. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. It's about the bigger picture. So we've talked about how D'Souza sees this dark side of consumerism, but he also gives us some ideas about how we can actually resist this pull, in our own lives. It's not just about critiquing the system, right? It's about taking responsibility. Like, what can we do?
Exactly. And he talks about what he calls a countercultural witness.
Okay.
It's this idea of like making deliberate choices that go against the grain, you know, even if they're small choices.
Like what? Give me some examples. What kinds of things?
Well, he talks about refusing to shop on Sundays, for example, which, for a lot of Christians, that's already a traditional practice. But it also sends a powerful message, right?
Yeah.
In this culture that's so obsessed with shopping.
Yeah.
Like he's basically saying, we don't need to be buying things 7 days a week.
Right.
He also talks about choosing to live more simply, buying only what you need, resisting that urge to always have the newest gadget, the latest fashion. It's about prioritizing experiences, relationships, those kinds of things over material possessions.
Okay, so those are all things we can, like as individuals, we can choose to do.
Right.
But, can those small acts, those little choices really make a difference?
I think they can. Because if enough people start making those choices, it can start to shift the culture.
Yeah.
Like it challenges the assumptions of a consumerist society. It creates this kind of countercurrent, a different way of being in the world.
I like that, a countercurrent.
And, it's not about being like anti-capitalist or anything like that. It's more about living out a different set of values within the system.
So it's not just about boycotting certain brands or, refusing to buy certain things.
Right. It's deeper than that.
It's about like cultivating a different mindset, right?
Yeah. It's about how you relate to things.
Yeah.
To material things.
And that sounds hard to like unlearn those ways of thinking, those habits that are so ingrained in our culture.
It is hard. And it definitely goes against a lot of the messages, like we were saying, we're bombarded with every day.
Right.
But it's an interesting thought experiment, at least, right? Like, what if enough people started to embrace this this countercultural way of life. What if consumerist attitudes started to decline? What would happen then?
Ooh, that is an interesting question. What do you think? Like from an economic perspective, because we're always told that, a strong economy depends on people spending money.
Right. That's the conventional wisdom. But what if it's not actually true?
Okay, wait. So you're saying there might be an economic price to pay for consumerism?
I think it's worth considering, because if you think about the environmental costs, right, the depletion of resources, the social problems that come with inequality,
Yeah, okay.
it starts to feel like maybe consumerism itself isn't sustainable.
That's a pretty radical idea, isn't it?
It is, but if that's true, then the question becomes, are we willing to accept, lower economic growth if it meant breaking free from this grip of consumerism?
Wow. I don't even know how to answer that. It's like we're caught in the system that's just pushing us in a certain direction, whether we like it or not.
And that kind of brings us back to D'Souza's point about the need for a strong ethical and cultural framework, right? Like if we want to create an economic system that's actually sustainable, that's humane, then we have to change the values that are driving it. We have to challenge that assumption that more is always better, that happiness comes from having more stuff.
It's like we talked about earlier with John Paul II and his warning against, was it absolutizing economic freedom? It feels like that's what we've done, and now we're seeing the consequences.
Yeah, I think so. And, it's important to remember that John Paul II wasn't just concerned about the wealthy. He believed that consumerism could be a problem for the poor too.
Really? How so?
Well, if you think about it, if your whole identity is tied up in what you own, if you're constantly measuring yourself by what you have or don't have, then not having those things, that can be really painful. It can create a sense of shame, of insecurity, and it leads to this constant striving, right? Yeah. This need for more that never really gets satisfied.
Yeah.
Richard John Neuhaus, he was a Catholic theologian.
Okay.
He actually argued that the poor can be just as consumed by what they don't have.
Oh, wow.
As the rich are consumed by what they do have.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Right. It's a different kind of consumerism, but it's just as destructive, I think.
It challenges that whole idea that consumerism is just a rich people problem.
Right, exactly. It's more like a spiritual problem.
Yeah.
That can manifest itself in different ways.
Yeah.
But the question at the heart of it all is, what are we really longing for?
Yeah.
What are we chasing after? Are we driven by this need for more, or are we seeking something deeper, something beyond the material world?
It's about getting to the root of the issue, I guess. Speaking of roots, it makes me think about that story in the Gospels about the rich young man who comes to Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
Asking about eternal life.
Powerful story. Very relevant, I think.
What's your take on that?
Well, Jesus tells the guy to sell all his possessions, give the money to the poor, but he walks away sad because he's too attached to his wealth. He can't let go.
It's a pretty stark warning, isn't it, about the dangers of putting our trust in material things?
Definitely. And it makes you ask yourself, are we willing to let go of the things that are holding us back from true freedom?
Yeah. Are our possessions our masters, or are they our servants? It's easy to judge that guy, that rich young man. But I think we all have our own versions of that story playing out in our lives, don't we?
I think so. We all have attachments, things we cling to that we're afraid to let go of.
And those attachments, they keep us from being truly free.
That's a really good point. And it goes back to what John Paul II was saying about the dignity of the human person. If we truly believe that we're more than just consumers, that we have a higher calling, then we have to start living like it.
Right.
Making choices that reflect that belief.
It's about recognizing that our worth isn't based on what we own. It's about who we are.
Exactly. And how we choose to live.
So where do we go from here? If we're really going to dive deeper into this idea of consumerism as bondage, like how do we even start to untangle those knots?
I think it starts with being honest with ourselves. Like asking ourselves some tough questions. What are we really attached to? What are the messages we're absorbing from the culture around us?
Yeah.
And most importantly, what do we want our lives to be about? What are the values that we want to guide our choices?
Those are great questions to sit with. And this whole conversation, this whole deep dive, I mean, it's given me a lot to think about for sure.
Me too. D'Souza's article, it really does raise some important questions about economic systems, about the power of culture, and ultimately about the choices that we make every day.
It's amazing. Like, we've been talking for quite a while now, and I still feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this whole consumerism thing.
I know, right? It really shows how complex it is. But I think, even without having all the answers, just by going through D'Souza's article, it's helped us at least ask better questions about it, about consumerism, about freedom.
Yeah, I think you're right. And for me, the biggest takeaway is that true freedom isn't about having more and more choices. It's more about making the choices that actually line up with our values, with like what we believe in, our purpose, all of that.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And it circles back to that Christian personalism idea we talked about before. Remember how John Paul II was saying that real freedom is tied to how we see the human person?
Yeah, I remember that.
He was saying that having economic freedom is super important for people to really thrive.
Yeah.
But he was also warning us about letting it become this idol, like this thing that takes over and pushes out those bigger values that actually give our lives meaning.
Right. It's about like finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Enjoying the good parts of a free market, like all the innovation and stuff, but staying aware of those consumerism traps that D'Souza talks about.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that takes a real shift in how we see things. It's about realizing that true freedom isn't about piling up more and more stuff. It's about living in a way that matches our values, using what we have to help others and make the world a better place.
Yeah, it sounds like a call to action for each of us, but also for all of us together,
Absolutely. Like on an individual level, we can be more careful about how we consume, choose experiences instead of just buying more things, and really invest in relationships instead of always wanting the latest gadgets or whatever. And as a society, we can push for policies that encourage sustainable choices, ethical buying, and making sure resources are shared fairly.
It all goes back to how we see our stuff, how we relate to the things we own.
Yeah.
D'Souza was saying that consumerism turns us into objects defined by what we have instead of people who can freely choose how we want to use those possessions.
That's so important. It's not about saying all material things are bad. It's about seeing that they can really have a grip on us, And like we discussed earlier, this isn't just something rich people struggle with. Everyone, rich or poor, can feel that pull, that desire for more, that fear of not having enough. It can be just as strong.
Wow. This has been, it's been a really eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I'm leaving with this new understanding of all the sneaky ways consumerism gets into our heads and affects how we act. And honestly, I feel inspired to make some changes in my own life, to think more carefully about my choices and really prioritize what matters most.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
And I hope our listeners are feeling that way too. His message is so important,
right,
especially now with social media and this constant pressure to project a certain image.
Yeah.
The temptation to find our identity and stuff is like stronger than ever.
It really is. It's like we're all living in this giant shopping mall.
Yeah.
And we're constantly bombarded with these messages telling us what we need to buy to be happy.
To be successful, to be loved.
Exactly.
And that's why it's so important to develop like a critical awareness.
Right.
To step back and ask ourselves, whose values am I really living by?
Yeah, like, am I letting my desires be shaped by advertising and social pressure? Or am I actually making choices that align with what I truly value?
It's about taking back control, reclaiming our freedom, our agency, our ability to choose what really matters.
It's about recognizing that we're more than just consumers, We're creators, we're contributors. Ultimately, we're called to something so much greater than ourselves.
That's the true path to freedom.
Yeah.
The freedom to live a life of purpose and meaning. A life that's not defined by what we own, but by who we are and how we impact the world around us.
I'm left with this question. How can we each find that balance in our own lives?
Yeah.
How can we use our economic freedom to actually serve our higher purpose?
Right.
And, contribute to a more just and compassionate world?
It's a question we all have to grapple with. There's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
But I think by reflecting on John Paul II's insights, having honest conversations about our values, our choices, and supporting initiatives that are promoting, a more human-centered economy,
right,
we can start moving in the right direction.
That's a powerful challenge.
It is.
And I think it's one we need to take seriously. Because in the end, our freedom, our happiness, the well-being of the world, it depends on it.
Absolutely. So, next time you're about to buy something you don't really need, just pause for a second and ask yourself, what am I really after here?
Yeah.
What's going to bring me real, lasting joy?
The most valuable things, they're not found on a store shelf. Right. They're found in our hearts.
Yeah.
And in the connections we make with others.
That's a truth worth holding on to.
It really is. And on that note, thanks for joining us. See you next time.